At 40, the bank balance feels smaller than the responsibilities. At 22, the new phone felt more important than saving. At 40, overdue bills sit heavier than the paper they're printed on. At 22, dinner with friends always came first. At 40, you check your wallet before you check your dreams. At 22, swiping the card felt effortless. At 40, the rent notice doesn't wait. At 22, the luxury apartment felt like success. At 40, work feels like survival. At 22, growth felt optional. At 40, you'd count coins to stretch the week. At 22, the paycheck disappeared in one weekend. At 40, a declined card feels personal. At 22, price tags were background noise. At 40, the furniture tells a story of making do. At 22, the car was chosen for status, not sense. At 40, your credit score decides your options. At 22, loan emails were ignored. At 40, you worked nights to catch up. At 22, mornings were slept through. At 40, unknown numbers bring anxiety. At 22, easy credit felt like free money. At 40, spreadsheets replace spontaneity. At 22, I'll save later was the plan. At 40, broken things stay broken longer. At 22, the newest gadget couldn't wait. At 40, savings feel like a distant memory. At 22, vacations felt urgent. At 40, the dashboard warning light stays on. At 22, upgrades felt necessary. At 40, overtime becomes normal. At 22, comfort was prioritized over growth. At 40, saying not now to your child hurts. At 22, saying why not to sneakers was easy. At 40, birthdays are simple by necessity. At 22, parties were financed by tomorrow. At 40, retirement feels close and underfunded. At 22, retirement felt invisible. At 40, rain feels colder at the bus stop. At 22, the expensive car felt like identity. At 40, repairs are postponed. At 22, upgrades were automatic. At 40, meals are measured carefully. At 22, delivery was daily routine. At 40, social media shows a life you can't afford. At 22, social media was the reason to spend. At 40, calculators become close friends. At 22, YOLO was the budget strategy. At 40, emergencies feel dangerous. At 22, emergency funds felt unnecessary. At 40, minimum payments feel like quicksand. At 22, maxing out felt normal. At 40, knocks on the door bring tension. At 22, image was worth the high rent. At 40, shoes are worn past their time. At 22, brands mattered more than balance. At 40, stress shows in your reflection. At 22, advice sounded boring. At 40, side hustles replace weekends. At 22, weekends replaced ambition. At 40, small spaces feel permanent. At 22, furniture was bought on future income. At 40, finance books feel urgent. At 22, scrolling felt easier than learning. At 40, invoices create silence. At 22, investing felt intimidating. At 40, groceries are calculated carefully. At 22, waste felt invisible. At 40, you live waiting for payday. At 22, payday was celebration day. At 40, money arguments feel exhausting. At 22, budgeting conversations were avoided. At 40, invitations require math. At 22, yes was automatic. At 40, silence brings reflection. At 22, pleasure beat planning. At 40, promotions pass by. At 22, skills were optional. At 40, the bank app brings anxiety. At 22, notifications were ignored. At 40, selling things feels necessary. At 22, buying things felt rewarding.
At 40, sleep is interrupted by numbers. At 22, late-night spending felt harmless. At 40, gray hairs reflect stress. At 22, budgeting felt restrictive. At 40, every gallon of gas matters. At 22, road trips had no limits. At 40, progress feels slow. At 22, investing felt like someone else's game. At 40, holidays mean working. At 22, holidays meant escaping responsibility. At 40, health is postponed for savings. At 22, money was spent to impress. At 40, job security feels like a cage. At 22, salary negotiation felt uncomfortable. At 40, sunsets bring quiet questions. At 22, short-term joy felt enough. At 40, you realize it was never one big mistake. At 22, it started with small daily choices.